Over the last couple of videos, I've been showing you a favourite strategic idea of Magnus Carlsen. He loves to play an early bishop to g5 in order to provoke the advance of the g-pawn. The problem with the advance of the g-pawn is that it weakens these squares on the king side, particularly the f5 square, and then he looks to exploit that by swinging the knight round to e3. Do check out that video if you haven't seen it. Carlsen's had enormous success with this. He's played it in so many occasions. Of course, he did not invent this idea. We could go back to the time of Wilhelm Steinitz, 150 years ago. Have a look at this game. So this was Steinitz Zuckertort, and watch what Steinitz does. He provokes g5, slightly different way, but basically it's the same idea. And then swings the knight round to g3, looking at that weakened f5 square. And I dare say Steinitz didn't invent this idea either. It's a pretty common idea. And indeed, some of us were playing like this before Carlsen was even born. In a moment, I'd like to show you one of my own games featuring exactly this idea. Before we get going with the game, let me mention that you can now go for an annual subscription on Patreon. I'm offering a 10% discount when you do that. So check out the links below. And when you subscribe to Patreon, then you get extra features, extra videos, newsletter, a test game. So do check out that. I'd be very grateful for your support. And thanks to those patrons who've already switched from a monthly to an annual subscription. It cuts down on transaction fees. Alternatively, if you can actually understand what I'm saying, alternatively, that's better. If you just want to make a one-off donation, if you want to chuck something in the hat, then you can always hit the PayPal button. Right, let's crack on with this game. So, playing white, Stefan Ingenerf, who is from Germany. And I was playing black. Actually, I'm gonna switch it round. And this was played in Wuppertal in 1986. There you go, 4 years before Carlsen was even born. So this was a tournament in Germany. I should say West Germany at that time. That's how old this game was. Now, I've been looking at games that Carlsen played in the Spanish. This is quite a different opening. So it's a Reti, and I've played this solid setup against it, which is basically a reverse Torre. So the aim is to blunt this bishop and to set up a nice centre. And now e5. So already looks to me like black is doing absolutely fine in this position. e4, but it's quite a standard variation actually. And bishop d6. Now, at this point, it's probably easiest to compare with the Spanish because actually the pawn structure is the same. The pieces are in different positions, but the pawn structure is the same. So let me just compare and contrast. Let me show you. Let me see. Well, okay, let's go right back to the beginning and look at the Spanish. So, for example, if we just play the main line of the Spanish and not d3, but let's do this. And castles and d4. Now, have a look at this structure. You can see it's exactly the same as I had in my game. Pieces in a very different place. I realise the pawn is on b5 as well. That makes a difference to the position. But in essence, it's a very similar structure with colours reversed. Let me go to our game. You see, same pawn structure. But the piece is just in different positions. And just like in Carlsen's game, or games, I should say, there's this pin, which is a bit irritating for white. Here, my opponent played Queen E2. Now, there are various ways you can play this position. I think this is quite a reliable way for white to play, to just step out of the pin and then to try to bring the knight to f5 like this. Another way, which I've played as white, is to exchange here and play c4. That's actually quite dangerous. Dangerous for both sides. And then black's best is probably just to go into a kind of reverse Benoni. So it changes the nature of the position completely. But I think my opponent had very much in mind a typical kind of King's Indian position in playing this Reti setup. And he went for Queen E2. And here he was provoked. So he went for G4 straight away. And I was delighted to see that. Just check out those squares. Just remember, at the moment, well, I'm a long way from occupying one of these squares. But let's see how we can achieve that. So if white pushes on with G5, that's exactly what black wants. Then that knight can hit the f4 square. Instead, my opponent played knight h4. Always got to be careful when you play this move, because there can be some tactics here to win that knight. Now here it doesn't work, because after knight takes e4, in fact, knight takes g6 is winning material. You can check that out yourself, but basically after this, white is a piece up, and after this, well, white ends up with extra material like that. So I can't take on e4. You could play knight c5 here, looking to come in on f4. I played rook e8, a bit more cautious. But, well, I had my reasons for playing this. I wanted to see what white was going to do, and the rook is always going to be useful on e8 opposite the queen. It's amazing how often tactics crop up. And my opponent chucked the knight in on f5. Okay, this is sort of what you do in the King's Indian. Looks quite menacing. Attacks the bishop. Well, I just came back, and actually I'm happy to have the bishop here. Still supports that one and can pop out to b6 sometimes. And my plan is either knight f8 to e6, just like in those Spanish positions, or possibly knight c5 to e6. Depends how white plays. I was expecting knight f3 here, and yeah, I would probably just play knight c5. But instead, knight g3 was played. So that came as a bit of a surprise. The idea is to embarrass that knight, because now the h5 square is covered. So I've got to stop g5, so h6. So I think this is what my opponent was trying to provoke, because now he's looking to open the position. He played knight f3, so that now he's ready to open up some lines with g5. Okay, so that's his idea. But actually I wasn't worried about that. I played knight f8. And if my opponent doesn't react, he played g5, by the way. So for example, if he just plays bishop d2, then I'll continue on with my strategy. Okay, let me make a random move for white to a4. Knight f4. This is really embarrassing for the queen. The knight is superbly placed, and if that knight is exchanged off, well, now we can see exactly why I moved the rook to e8. That is really nasty. So after knight f8, my opponent played g5. So that was his plan. He wants to open lines. And, well, if I exchange, then knight takes g5, followed by h4, h5. Well, this is an extremely double-edged position. But I didn't take on g5. Instead, I played knight h5. That's a very appealing move. Remember, I want to get in on that key square, that weakened square, f4, having provoked the g-pawn to advance. Now, if my opponent were to just exchange off, then that pin is really annoying. After this, the queen could come to f6, maybe knight d4, maybe knight f4. That's already looking really critical for white. It doesn't really matter about this pawn. So knight h5 just played. My opponent took on h6, and of course I don't bother recapturing, just knight f4. So I've achieved my aim of getting a knight on f4. It's amazing how often this happens. You know, if you've got this in your mind's eye. Queen is attacked, and that's really nasty. So if the knight is exchanged off, again, this opens up the e-file, and the knight can't appear on f5 because I just take it as a pin. Pin and win. So my opponent put the queen back on d1, not a happy decision, and I just supported the knight with queen f6. Again, there is absolutely no need to recapture that pawn. Far better just to get my pieces into the attack very quickly. If pawn takes here, then just knight here, and it's getting worse and worse for white. My opponent took on d5. I think that's sort of desperation, really. It's very hard for white to find any kind of good move here. I recaptured, and understandably my opponent wanted to get rid of that menacing knight on f4. He exchanged off. E takes f4, it's looking lovely. Attacking the knight, and that is very embarrassing. Well, you hardly want to go into the corner. But returning to e2 also isn't great. So I just kept going. Bishop h5. Returning to this wonderful diagonal. And this pin is still a massive issue for white. If that knight ever moves, well, obviously e2 at the moment is on, but there's also f3. It's really difficult. My opponent took here, and I played knight g6. That's nice. I might well be coming into h4. And yeah, if, let's say, knight d4, trying to sort of straighten things out, you know, maybe you can play queen d2. Well, just knight h4 just increases the pressure, and bishop b6. Look at this. This is attacked. This is attacked. The bishop is attacked. Actually, white's position is falling apart. So, knight g6 just played. Rook e1. Knight h4. So I just want to get rid of this piece and push on and get this bishop into the game. And there's nothing better than to exchange. And the threat is f3, among others. I mean, black is probably just threatening to double or, you know, swing the rook to g6. I mean, it's such an easy attack. So f3 played. Oh, how do you think that bishop on g2 is feeling at the moment? He's had better days at the office, I'm telling you. Rook e3. Boom! Just head in on that dart square. Lovely. And that's hit as well. Bishop takes f3. This is not very complicated. I'm just crashing through. Queen g3 check. And f3. It's completely winning for black. Queen takes mate threatened, and the game ended like this. F takes g2, and here my opponent resigned. Yeah, no, absolutely no defense. Queen h2 threatened. If let me see, queen takes g2, I can take on e1, so that's an extra rook. And if, well, let's finish like this. Here, and I get a new queen. And that looks like mate next move. Like that. That'll do. Wow. I tell you what, I really enjoyed that attack. So game over in 28 moves. But, I mean, frankly, by the time I got to this position after move 16, I was pretty confident I was going to notch up the point. And once again, we see this idea of the early pin provoking this move g4. It's funny, when white plays g4 here, you just think, what's the big deal? But it doesn't take many moves for a black knight to hit f4, and then white's attack gets nowhere, and it's black that crashes in. Hope you enjoyed that. Thanks very much for watching.